December 20th, 1922. Snow fell in thick, heavy curtains across the Minnesota landscape, blanketing Redwood Falls in pristine white. Margaret Wheeler clutched the cream-colored envelope in her gloved hand as she trudged up the path to her modest home. The elegant, swooping script of her name on the front contrasted sharply with the utilitarian mailbox it had arrived in. Inside, she hung her coat on the rack and examined the invitation more closely. The paper was expensive, thicker than anything she'd ever received, with an embossed golden border that caught the light from her kerosene lamp. The seal on the back featured an ornate L pressed into deep red wax. "Thomas," she called to her husband, "we've received something unusual." Thomas Wheeler emerged from his study, wiping ink-stained fingers on a handkerchief. As the town's only journalist, he'd developed a keen eye for the extraordinary, and the envelope immediately captured his attention. "Who's it from?" he asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Margaret carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "It's from the Larkins. They've invited us to their Christmas Eve gathering at the estate." Thomas's eyebrows shot up. "The Larkins? I thought they never entertained." "They don't," Margaret confirmed, scanning the invitation. "Not in the 20 years they've owned that place. It says they're hosting a select group from town, a dinner and overnight stay." Thomas took the invitation, studying it. The Larkin estate stood 3 miles outside of town, a sprawling Victorian mansion perched atop Blackwood Hill. Built in the 1880s, it had changed hands numerous times before the Larkin family purchased it in 1902. Since then, the family had been polite but distant fixtures in Redwood Falls, appearing in town only for essential business before retreating back behind their wrought-iron gates. "Why now?" Thomas mused. "And why us?" Margaret shrugged. "It says here they wish to become more integrated with the community. Perhaps they're lonely. Or they want something," Thomas replied, his journalist's skepticism evident. Nobody changes 20 years of behavior without reason. Despite his suspicions, Thomas couldn't deny the professional opportunity. An exclusive invitation to the mysterious Larkin estate was precisely the kind of story that could get him noticed by the bigger newspapers in Minneapolis. "We should accept," Margaret said, reading his thoughts. "It could be good for your career. Besides, I'm curious about that house. People talk." Thomas nodded slowly. "What do they say again?" "That the clocks run backwards sometimes. That flowers bloom in winter in their greenhouse. That servants age rapidly and leave within months." She waved her hand dismissively. "Town gossip, most likely." Thomas moved to his desk and drafted a response, accepting the invitation. As he sealed the envelope, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the lamp despite the closed windows. "Odd," Margaret whispered, striking a match to relight it. Thomas glanced toward the window. For just a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the snow outside, tall and thin, watching their home. But when he blinked and looked again, there was nothing but swirling white. "What is it?" Margaret asked, noticing his expression. "Nothing," he replied, though an inexplicable chill had settled in his bones. "Just my imagination." That night, Thomas dreamed of clocks with backward-spinning hands and woke to find his mirror reflection showing a face subtly older than the one he'd gone to sleep with. He dismissed it as a trick of the poor morning light. But the unease lingered as the days counted down toward Christmas Eve. The carriage wheels crunched through the frozen snow as Thomas and Margaret approached the imposing gates of the Larkin estate on Christmas Eve afternoon. 4 other carriages were already parked in the circular driveway. The Prescotts, wealthy owners of the local bank, Dr. Wells and his wife, Mayor Holloway and his young second wife, and the Andersons, who owned the largest general store in town, all prominent citizens of Redwood Falls. The estate was even more impressive up close, 3 stories of dark stone and wood, with a central tower that rose another 20 feet above the roofline. Countless windows reflected the fading December light, and elaborate gargoyles perched at each corner of the roof. Smoke curled from several of the dozen chimneys, promising warmth within. A servant in formal attire greeted them at the entrance. "Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler," he announced, taking their coats. "The last of our guests, please follow me." Thomas noted with professional curiosity that the servant's hands trembled slightly, and deep lines creased a face that seemed too young for such weathering. The man's hair was prematurely grey at the temples. "You've worked for the Larkins long?" Thomas inquired casually. 3 months, sir," the man replied, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "You seem—" Thomas hesitated, searching for a diplomatic phrase. "Tired?" The servant offered a thin smile. "The work is demanding. But Mr. Larkin compensates generously." They were led through a grand foyer with a ceiling that soared 20 feet above them, dominated by a crystal chandelier that cast prismatic patterns across marble floors. The walls were lined with portraits, ancestors, Thomas presumed, their stern faces following the newcomers as they passed. In the main parlor, the other guests mingled before a roaring fire. A long table had been set with sterling silver and fine china, crystal glasses catching the light from more chandeliers. "Thomas and Margaret Wheeler," announced a deep voice from the staircase. "Welcome to our home." Augustus Larkin descended toward them. A tall man with silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating grey eyes. His wife, Eliza, followed, her black dress emphasizing her pallor. Behind them came their 3 children. James, about 20, Victoria, perhaps 18, and young Henry, no more than 12. All shared the same striking features: high cheekbones, full lips, and those unusual grey eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "We're honored by the invitation," Thomas said, extending his hand. Augustus's grip was ice-cold, despite the warmth of the room. "The honor is ours," Augustus replied. "Your newspaper keeps our community connected. Information is precious." Thomas nodded, noting the odd emphasis. "It's my privilege to serve Redwood Falls. And how you serve it matters greatly," Augustus continued, maintaining eye contact a moment longer than comfortable. "Now please, join the others. Dinner will be served at 7 precisely." As they moved to join the other guests, Margaret whispered, "Did you notice? No Christmas decorations." Thomas surveyed the room. She was right. No tree, no holly, no festive touches, despite it being Christmas Eve. The only seasonal element was the snow visible through the tall windows and the fire in the massive hearth. "Perhaps they don't celebrate," he suggested. "Then why host on Christmas Eve?" Before Thomas could speculate, Dr. Wells approached them, his usual jovial demeanor subdued. "Wheeler," he greeted Thomas, "glad to see another sensible face. This place gives me the creeps." "It's certainly austere," Thomas allowed. "More than that," Wells lowered his voice. "I treated a maid who worked here last year, 22 years old, but her body was showing signs of advanced aging. Arthritis, cataracts, thinning bones, medical anomalies I couldn't explain." Margaret frowned. "Perhaps a rare condition." "Perhaps," Wells conceded, "but she wasn't the first. 3 former Larkin servants have come to me with similar symptoms in the past 5 years." A bell rang, signaling dinner. As they moved toward the dining room, Thomas noticed a peculiar clock on the mantel. While the hands moved clockwise, the numbers around the face were arranged counterclockwise. Henry, the youngest Larkin, caught Thomas staring. "Father says it's how time actually flows," the boy said, his voice small but clear. "We just perceive it wrong." "An interesting philosophy," Thomas replied carefully. Henry nodded solemnly. "Tonight you'll see. Tonight everyone sees." The boy moved away to join his family at the head of the table, leaving Thomas with a creeping sense of disquiet as they took their assigned seats. The dining room stretched beneath a coffered ceiling, dark wood paneling absorbing the candlelight. A massive table of polished mahogany dominated the space, laden with silver serving dishes and crystal decanters. Augustus Larkin sat at the head, with Eliza at the foot. The guests were arranged between them, with Thomas seated directly across from Victoria Larkin, whose grey eyes rarely left his face. Servants moved silently, filling glasses with deep red wine that seemed to catch the light oddly, appearing almost black in certain angles. Thomas noted that all the servants shared the same trait. They looked exhausted, aged beyond their years. "A toast," Augustus announced, raising his glass, "to new friends and old traditions. May this night be remembered." Something in his tone made Thomas hesitate before drinking, but social pressure won out. The wine tasted rich and complex, with an unfamiliar metallic undertone that lingered on his tongue. "Do you enjoy your work, Mr. Wheeler?" Victoria asked, her voice melodic yet somehow hollow. "Very much," Thomas replied. "Chronicling the lives of our town keeps me connected to its heart." "The heart," she repeated, smiling slightly. "Yes, connections to the heart are essential." The first course arrived, a clear soup that steamed despite the bowls being oddly cool to the touch. Thomas glanced at Margaret, who was engaged in conversation with James Larkin. Her cheeks were flushed from the wine. "My father admires your dedication," Victoria continued. "He says you understand the value of observation, of bearing witness." "High praise from a man I've barely met," Thomas noted. Victoria's smile widened. "Oh, but he's observed you for years. We all have. Your articles show perception, empathy, essential qualities for tonight." Before Thomas could question this cryptic statement, Augustus called for attention. "I'm sure you're all wondering why you've been invited. Why, after 20 years of privacy, we've opened our doors." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to their host. "Our family has a tradition," Augustus explained. "Every 30 years we must share our blessing, our burden, with those worthy of understanding." Mayor Holloway chuckled nervously. "Sounds rather dramatic, Larkin. What blessing do you mean?" Augustus didn't smile. "Time, Mayor. We have conquered time." An uncomfortable silence followed before Dr. Wells cleared his throat. "In what sense, exactly?" "In every sense that matters." Eliza spoke for the first time, her voice surprisingly strong. "We do not experience time as others do. We can redistribute it." Thomas felt Margaret's hand grip his knee under the table. They exchanged glances, both recognizing the conversation had taken an unsettling turn. "I don't follow," Thomas said carefully. "You will," James assured him, raising his glass. "By morning, you'll understand completely." Dinner progressed through multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last, yet somehow lacking flavor despite their appearance. Thomas noted that the Larkins ate very little, merely pushing food around their plates, while encouraging their guests to indulge. The wine, however, flowed freely. As the meal continued, Thomas became increasingly aware of the clocks. Each room they'd seen contained at least one, all with the reversed numbering. More disturbing, they seemed unsynchronized, some running slightly faster, others slower, their ticking forming an arrhythmic symphony that prickled at his consciousness. By dessert, a molded pudding that collapsed under the spoon like sand, Thomas felt a strange heaviness in his limbs. The conversations around him seemed to stretch and compress, words elongating, then rushing together. Margaret, beside him, pressed a hand to her temple. "Are you well?" Thomas whispered. "Just tired," she murmured. "And something feels wrong." Augustus rose, commanding attention once more. "The hour grows late. We've prepared rooms for each of you. Tomorrow morning we'll share Christmas breakfast before you return to town." "I'm not sure we should stay," Margaret whispered to Thomas. "I feel strange." Thomas nodded, the journalist in him sensing a story, but the husband concerned for his wife. "Mr. Larkin, while we appreciate your hospitality, perhaps we should return home tonight." Augustus's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I'm afraid that's impossible. The roads have become impassable with snow, and our gatekeeper has retired for the night. You are all our guests until morning." Thomas glanced toward the windows. Snow was indeed falling heavily now, the wind audibly howling against the glass. When had that storm begun? "Now," Augustus continued, "let us show you to your rooms. Rest is important on this night, essential in fact." As they rose from the table, Thomas noticed Mayor Holloway stumble slightly. His wife caught him, but Thomas observed with journalistic detachment that her hands appeared more lined than they had at the beginning of dinner. A trick of the light, surely. Victoria appeared at Thomas's elbow. "You'll be in the East Wing," she said, "the room with the best view of the sunrise. Father insisted." "Why?" Thomas couldn't stop himself from asking. Victoria's smile remained fixed. "Because you're the witness, Mr. Wheeler, the one who will tell the story when it's over." The bedroom assigned to Thomas and Margaret was luxuriously appointed with heavy velvet draperies, a massive four-poster bed, and antique furniture that must have been worth a fortune. A fire burned in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the wallpapered walls. True to Victoria's word, large windows faced eastward, though now they showed only darkness and swirling snow. As soon as the door closed behind them, Margaret sank onto the edge of the bed. "Thomas, something isn't right. I feel older." Thomas knelt before her, taking her hands. "It's just fatigue and strange surroundings," he assured her, though he'd felt it too, an unusual stiffness in his joints, a heaviness behind his eyes that went beyond normal tiredness. He moved to the mirror above the dresser and studied his reflection. Was there more grey at his temples than this morning? Were the lines around his eyes deeper? He couldn't be certain in the fluctuating firelight. "We should leave," Margaret insisted. "Storm or no storm." Thomas tried the door, finding it unlocked. "Let me check the hallway. Perhaps the others are feeling the same unease." The corridor outside was dimly lit by gas lamps that created pools of golden light at intervals. Thomas moved quietly toward the stairs, hearing nothing but the omnipresent ticking of clocks. As he passed another guest room, he heard soft weeping from within, a woman's voice, though he couldn't identify whose. At the top of the stairs he hesitated, hearing voices from below. Carefully, he peered over the banister. In the grand foyer, the Larkin family stood in a circle, hands joined, heads bowed. They were chanting softly in a language Thomas didn't recognize, something guttural and ancient-sounding. Young Henry looked up suddenly, his grey eyes seeming to glow in the dim light. Thomas pulled back instinctively. When he dared look again, the family had disappeared. Retreating to his room, Thomas found Margaret standing at the window. "The storm's stopped," she said without turning, "and there's something in the garden." Thomas joined her at the window. The snow had indeed ceased, and a full moon now illuminated the estate grounds with silvery light. In the formal garden below, 5 figures moved among the snow-covered hedges, carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. They were measuring distances, driving stakes into the ground in a pentagonal pattern. "What are they doing?" Margaret whispered. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I'm going to find out." Margaret clutched his arm. "No, stay here, please." Before Thomas could respond, a soft knock sounded at their door. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. The knock came again, more insistent. "Who's there?" Thomas called, moving cautiously toward the door. "Please," came a whispered response. "Help me." Thomas opened the door a crack to find the servant who had greeted them upon arrival. In the hours since, the man seemed to have aged years, his hair now completely grey, his face deeply lined. "What's happening to us?" the man rasped, his hands trembling violently. "I've been here 3 months. I was 26 when I arrived." Thomas pulled him inside and closed the door. The man looked like he was in his 50s now, his back beginning to stoop. "What's your name?" Margaret asked gently. "Edward. Edward Collins." He sank into an armchair. "They didn't tell me what service here would cost. None of us knew." "Cost?" Thomas pressed. "They're taking it from us," Edward whispered. "Our time, our years, harvesting them somehow." "That's impossible," Thomas said, though the evidence sat trembling before him. Edward laughed bitterly. "So I thought, but look at me, and soon you'll see it in yourselves. It happens faster on this night every 30 years. That's when they take the most." "Why?" Margaret asked. "Why would they do this?" To extend their own lives, Edward explained. They've been doing it for generations. The family arrives in a town, stays for decades, taking small amounts of time from servants and townspeople who work closely with them. Then, once every 30 years, they harvest a greater quantity from select victims. Thomas remembered Augustus's toast, "To new friends and old traditions," the meaning now horrifyingly clear. "How do they do it?" Thomas demanded. Edward shook his head. "I don't know exactly. Something to do with the clocks, the wine, and what they're preparing in the garden. By morning," his voice broke, "by morning they'll have taken 30 years from each of us. Some won't survive it." Margaret pressed her hands to her mouth. "We have to warn the others." "It's too late," Edward said. "They're all locked in now. The doors, the windows, they'll open again at sunrise. But by then, the transfer will be complete." Thomas moved to the window again. The Larkins had finished whatever preparation they were making in the garden and were now retreating toward the house. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Dr. Wells was also watching from his window. Their eyes met across the distance, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. "There must be a way to stop this," Thomas insisted, turning back to Edward. "Some weakness in their method." Edward's expression was bleak. "The only ones who ever escaped were a couple in 1892. They destroyed the master clock in Augustus's study during the ceremony. It disrupted the process, caused a backlash. Half the house burned down that night." "The master clock," Thomas repeated. "Where is this study?" "West wing, second floor, but you'll never reach it. They'll be guarding it." Thomas checked his pocket watch. Nearly midnight. If Edward was right, they had until sunrise before whatever sinister process the Larkins had initiated would be complete. "I'm going to try," Thomas decided. "Margaret, stay here with Edward." Margaret seized his hand. "Thomas, look at your watch." He glanced down. The hands were moving counterclockwise. Outside in the hallway, the grandfather clock began to strike midnight, each chime reverberating through the house like a physical force. And somewhere below, the chanting resumed. The chimes of midnight echoed through the Larkin estate, each reverberating toll seeming to pull at something deep within Thomas's chest. He felt a strange tugging sensation, as though invisible threads were attempting to unravel his very essence. Margaret gasped beside him, clutching at her throat. "It's beginning," Edward whispered, his face contorting with a spasm of pain. Before their eyes, a new wrinkle formed across his brow, etching itself deeper with each passing second. Thomas moved to the mirror, confirmed his growing suspicion. The grey at his temples had spread, salt and pepper now streaking through his once dark hair. Fine lines had appeared around his eyes that hadn't been there at dinner. Margaret joined him, her hand trembling as she touched her reflection, her auburn hair now threaded with silver, crow's feet forming at the corners of her eyes. "We're aging," she breathed. "Yes," Edward confirmed, "but slowly compared to what will come near dawn. This is just the beginning, the opening of the channels, they call it." Thomas strode to the door. "I won't wait here to wither away. We need to find that clock." "You can't go alone," Margaret insisted. "And I can't risk you," Thomas countered. "Stay with Edward. If I'm not back in 30 minutes... "Then what?" Margaret demanded. "What could I possibly do?" Thomas had no answer. Instead, he kissed her forehead, noting with a pang how her skin had lost some of its firmness beneath his lips. "Lock the door behind me." The hallway was different now, the gas lamps burning with a bluish flame that cast sickly light across the walls. The air itself felt thicker, as though moving through shallow water. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, listening. The chanting continued from somewhere below, rhythmic and hypnotic. He moved carefully toward the west wing, where Edward had indicated Augustus's study would be. As he rounded the corner, he nearly collided with Mrs. Prescott from the bank. She staggered against the wall, her face a mask of confusion and fear. "Mrs. Prescott," Thomas whispered. "Are you all right?" She stared at him uncomprehendingly for a moment before recognition dawned. "Mr. Wheeler." What's happening to us? Her voice cracked, the voice of a much older woman emerging from her middle-aged throat. The Larkins are stealing our time somehow, Thomas explained quickly. We need to find the master clock in Augustus's study. Can you walk? She nodded shakily. Herbert, my husband, he collapsed, clutched his chest. I came looking for help. Thomas felt a chill. The process was affecting them all differently, perhaps related to their initial age or health. Where's Dr. Wells's room? 2 doors down from ours, east wing. Go there, Thomas instructed. Tell him about your husband. Tell him what's happening. I'm going to try to stop this. Mrs. Prescott nodded and shuffled back the way she'd come, moving like a woman 20 years her senior. Thomas continued toward the west wing, the chanting growing louder. He had to flatten himself against the wall several times to avoid servants who moved through the halls with purpose, carrying various objects. Candles, small vials of liquid, ancient-looking books. None of them noticed him, their eyes glazed and unfocused. Finally, he reached a corridor lined with portraits of the Larkin family through generations. Thomas paused, studying them with growing horror. The same faces appeared repeatedly across different time periods. Augustus in Victorian dress, then Edwardian, then modern. Eliza, recognizable despite changing hairstyles and fashions, appearing in paintings dated decades apart. The children, subtly aging across centuries of portraits. At the end of the corridor stood an ornate door, light spilling from beneath it. Thomas approached cautiously, hearing a different sound from within. Not chanting, but the ticking of numerous clocks, all slightly out of sync, creating a cacophony of clicks and tocks that set his teeth on edge. He tested the handle, locked. Kneeling, he peered through the keyhole. Beyond was a spacious study dominated by a massive desk. The walls were lined with clocks of every description, grandfather clocks, cuckoo clocks, ornate mantelpieces, all with the same reversed numbering. At the center of the room on a pedestal sat what must be the master clock, larger than the others, crafted of dark wood and gleaming brass, with a face that seemed to swirl and shift as he watched. As Thomas observed, the door to the study opened from within. He barely had time to retreat into the shadows of a nearby alcove before James Larkin emerged, carrying a leather-bound ledger. Thomas held his breath as James passed within inches of his hiding place, the young man's face eerily serene. When James had disappeared down the stairs, Thomas returned to the door. It had been left unlocked. Taking a deep breath, he entered the study. The ticking was overwhelming inside, a physical pressure against his eardrums. The air smelled of clock oil, old books, and something metallic that reminded him uncomfortably of blood. Thomas moved directly to the master clock, examining it for any weakness or mechanism he could disrupt. The clock's face was mesmerizing, the numerals shifting positions subtly as he watched, the hands moving in complex patterns that seemed to defy the simple mechanics of clockwork. Around the edge of the face were inscribed symbols he didn't recognize, not letters of any alphabet he knew, but curves and angles that hurt his eyes to focus on. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" came a voice behind him. Thomas whirled to find Victoria Larkin standing in the doorway, her grey eyes reflecting the light strangely. She looked exactly as she had at dinner, not a day older, while Thomas could feel the additional years weighing on his own frame. "What is it?" Thomas asked, playing for time, mind racing for a way past her. Victoria approached, her movements fluid and graceful. A harvester, a collector of life's most precious resource, time. She gestured around the room. These are all connected to it, channels through which the years flow. But this one controls them all. "You're stealing our lives," Thomas accused. Victoria tilted her head, genuinely puzzled. "Is it stealing to take what's freely given? You accepted our invitation, drank our wine, slept beneath our roof. We didn't know the cost. The cost is always time, Mr. Wheeler. Every choice, every action. We're merely more efficient in our collection." She stepped closer. "We need it more than you do. Our family has a purpose that spans centuries. What purpose could justify this? Victoria smiled enigmatically. Some questions require decades to answer. Perhaps if you survive until morning, I'll explain it to you. Thomas glanced at the heavy paperweight on Augustus's desk, a potential weapon. Victoria followed his gaze, her smile widening. Violence won't help you, Mr. Wheeler. Even if you destroyed this clock, there are others. The process has begun. The channels are open. The fire of 1892, Thomas challenged. Someone escaped then. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. A miscalculation. We've since improved our methods. Behind her, the door opened again. Augustus entered, followed by Eliza and Henry. All three looked as fresh as they had at dinner, while Thomas could feel new aches in joints that had been flexible just hours ago. "Victoria," Augustus said softly, "you shouldn't be here. It's nearly time for the garden ceremony." "Father, Mr. Wheeler was admiring our clock collection," she replied smoothly. "As a journalist, he appreciates the value of recording time." Augustus's grey eyes fixed on Thomas, assessing. "Indeed. Though some records are best left to those who understand their significance." "What happens at the garden ceremony?" Thomas demanded. "Completion," Augustus answered simply. "The final transfer. It's quite painless, I assure you." "For you, perhaps." Augustus smiled thinly. "Perspective is everything, Mr. Wheeler. From where we stand, this is mercy. A few individuals giving up years they would likely waste to fuel work of genuine importance. Murder disguised as philosophy," Thomas spat. Augustus sighed. "Let me show you something, Mr. Wheeler. Perhaps it will help you understand." He moved to a bookshelf and pulled a volume bound in cracked leather. Opening it, he revealed yellowed pages covered in the same strange symbols that adorned the clock face. "This text dates from 1412, Augustus explained. "It contains knowledge that would transform humanity's understanding of time, space, and consciousness. Knowledge our family has been entrusted to protect and expand upon. Each generation adds to it, building toward a culmination that will benefit all of mankind. At the cost of stolen lives," Thomas countered. "Borrowed time," Augustus corrected. "Energy redirected. Nothing is truly lost, merely redistributed." A bell tolled somewhere in the house, a deep resonant sound that Thomas felt in his bones. "Ah," said Augustus, "the summons. We must prepare for the garden ceremony." He turned to Victoria. "Take Mr. Wheeler back to his room. Ensure he's comfortable until morning." As Victoria took Thomas's arm, he felt a new wave of fatigue wash over him. His knees nearly buckled as another year seemed to drain from him in an instant. "Don't fight it," Victoria advised quietly. "It only accelerates the process." As she led him from the study, Thomas caught one last glimpse of the master clock. For just a moment, he thought he saw faces reflected in its brass case. Dozens of them, mouths open in silent screams as they aged and withered away. Victoria escorted Thomas through corridors that seemed longer than before, the walls occasionally rippling like reflections in disturbed water. His perception had begun to alter, moments of crystal clarity interspersed with foggy confusion. His body felt increasingly foreign, joints stiffening with each step. "You were chosen carefully," Victoria said conversationally, as though discussing the weather rather than theft of human life. "Father values your observational skills, your empathy. Most importantly, your connection to the town." "The town," Thomas repeated, a new realization dawning through his fatigue. "You're not just taking from us. This affects everyone in Redwood Falls, doesn't it?" Victoria's smile was almost approving. "Very good, Mr. Wheeler. Yes, the principal transfer happens with those present, but there's a ripple effect. A subtle acceleration of time throughout the area. Nothing dramatic, perhaps a month or two of additional aging for most residents. They'll attribute it to harsh winter conditions, poor diet, the natural progression of life." "You're monsters," Thomas whispered. "We're survivors," Victoria corrected. "And visionaries. You see only tonight's sacrifice, not the centuries of work it enables." They had reached his room. Victoria opened the door, revealing Margaret sitting beside Edward, whose condition had deteriorated dramatically. His hair had gone completely white, skin hanging from his frame like ill-fitting clothes. Margaret looked up, her face now lined, hair streaked liberally with grey. "Thomas!" she gasped, rising shakily to her feet. She appeared to have aged 15 years since he'd left. Victoria released Thomas's arm. "Rest. The worst will be over by morning." "What happens then?" Thomas demanded. "Those who survive will return to town with only fragmented memories of this night. Within days, those memories will fade entirely." Victoria's expression softened slightly. "It's a kindness, truly." After she departed, Thomas collapsed onto the edge of the bed. Margaret's hands, now spotted with age, clasped his. "Did you find it?" "The clock?" "Yes, but it was guarded, and destroying it may not be enough now." He described what he'd learned. "They're planning some kind of ceremony in the garden. The final transfer, Augustus called it." Edward, barely conscious, stirred at this. "The pentagram," he whispered. 5 points for 5 guests. Perfect symmetry." Thomas moved to the window. In the moonlit garden below, servants were positioning 5 chairs in a circle around a central object, covered by a cloth. The Larkin family stood nearby, now dressed in ceremonial robes of deep crimson. "We have to disrupt that ceremony," Thomas decided. "It might be our only chance." Margaret looked doubtful. "How? We can barely walk at this point." Thomas considered their options. Direct confrontation was impossible in their weakened state. Destroying the master clock would require getting past Augustus and his family, but perhaps there was another way. "The other guests," he said suddenly, "if we could warn them, unite our efforts." A scream cut through the night, high-pitched, agonized, coming from somewhere down the hall. Then silence. "That sounded like Mrs. Holloway," Margaret whispered. "I need to check," Thomas said, moving painfully toward the door. "No," Edward called weakly from his chair. "Don't separate." "That's what they want, divided victims." Thomas hesitated, torn between investigating and heeding the warning. Another cry decided him, not a scream this time, but a man's voice raised in anger or pain. "Lock the door behind me," he instructed Margaret. "I'll be back as quickly as I can." In the hallway, Thomas followed the sounds of disturbance to a room at the far end. The door stood ajar, spilling lamplight into the corridor. Thomas approached cautiously, peering inside. Mayor Holloway knelt beside the bed, cradling his wife's lifeless form. She appeared to have aged decades in hours, her once blonde hair now white, skin deeply wrinkled and spotted with age, lips blue. She was only 32. Holloway sobbed. His own face now resembling that of a 60-year-old man. Her heart couldn't take it. Thomas entered, placing a hand on Holloway's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Charles, but we need to act quickly or we'll all share her fate." Holloway looked up, grief giving way to rage. "The Larkins did this. Somehow they did this to her." "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "They're stealing our time, our years. And there's going to be some sort of ceremony in the garden soon that will complete the process. How do we stop it? We need to gather the others who are still able, disrupt the ceremony. There's a master clock in Augustus's study that controls the process. If we could damage it." Holloway rose unsteadily. "The Prescotts? Dr. Wells? I sent Mrs. Prescott to find Wells earlier. Her husband was having chest pains. Then we should check there next." Together, they made their way to Wells's room, finding the door locked. Thomas knocked urgently. "Who is it?" came Wells's suspicious voice. "Thomas Wheeler and Mayor Holloway. Let us in, quickly." The door opened to reveal a scene of grim determination. Dr. Wells, now appearing in his 70s rather than his 50s, stood with a makeshift weapon, a fire poker, in his hand. Behind him, Mrs. Prescott sat weeping silently by the bed where her husband lay unconscious, his breathing shallow. "Herbert's had a heart attack," Wells explained tersely. "I've done what I can, but—" He gestured helplessly at his trembling, aged hands. "Mrs. Holloway? Dead," Thomas said quietly. The strain was too much for her. Wells nodded grimly. I suspected as much when I heard her cry out. We're all deteriorating at different rates. Those with existing health concerns or of advanced age are suffering the worst effects. We need to stop this, Thomas insisted. They're preparing some kind of ceremony in the garden. Augustus called it the final transfer. I've been watching them, Wells confirmed, moving to the window. They've arranged chairs in a pentagram formation. One for each of us, I presume. What do they want us to do? Mrs. Prescott asked, her voice cracking. Simply walk out there and surrender the rest of our lives. They won't give us a choice, Thomas replied. Victoria mentioned something about a summons that we won't be able to resist. Mayor Holloway gripped the bedpost for support. Then we act now, before we're too weak, before this summoning begins. The clock, Thomas explained. There's a master clock in Augustus's study that seems to control the process. If we could damage it somehow. I saw it, Wells interrupted. Earlier I was exploring and glimpsed it through a doorway. Bizarre contraption, almost seemed alive somehow. We need a distraction, Thomas decided. Something to draw the family away from the study while one of us gets to the clock. Fire, suggested Holloway darkly. Edward mentioned that the couple who escaped in 1892 started a fire. It's fitting. Too dangerous, Wells countered. In our condition, we might not escape the flames ourselves. Thomas thought quickly. What about the garden preparations? If we disrupted those, they'd have to reset them. That might work, Wells agreed. I noticed they were being extremely precise with the positioning of everything. From outside came the sound of a bell, deeper and more resonant than before. Thomas felt it vibrating in his chest, pulling at something deep inside him. The others clearly felt it too, each of them stiffening. The summons, Thomas whispered. We need to move now. I'll go to the garden, Holloway volunteered. I have nothing left to lose. I'll try for the clock, Thomas said. Dr. Wells, can you help Margaret get to my room? Edward is there too. He might know more that could help us. Wells nodded. What about Mrs. Prescott and Herbert? I'll stay with my husband, Mrs. Prescott said firmly. Go. The bell sounded again, stronger this time. Thomas felt his knees buckle slightly, an overwhelming urge to walk toward the garden flooding through him. He gritted his teeth against it. Hurry, he gasped. The compulsion is getting stronger. They separated in the hallway, each fighting the supernatural pull toward the garden ceremony. Thomas staggered toward the west wing, using the wall for support as his aging body protested each step. Behind him, he heard Holloway descend the stairs toward the garden entrance. The corridors seemed to shift and blur around him, time and space distorting. At one point, Thomas found himself face to face with young Henry Larkin, who regarded him with those uncanny grey eyes. You're fighting it, the boy observed. Interesting. Most don't even try. Henry, Thomas gasped. Why? Why does your family do this? The boy tilted his head. For the work, of course. Father says we're building towards something magnificent. The great culmination. At what cost? Everything worthwhile has a price, Mr. Wheeler. The boy smiled unnervingly. Father says that time is the only true currency. We simply make more efficient transactions than most. Thomas leaned heavily against the wall. You're just a child. You don't have to be part of this. Something flickered in Henry's expression. Uncertainty, perhaps. I was born into it. 10 generations of Larkins have contributed to the work. And how many hundreds of innocent lives have paid for it? Henry's face hardened. They're not innocent. No one is. Everyone wastes the time they're given. We put it to better use. The bell tolled again, and Thomas doubled over as the pull intensified. Henry watched him dispassionately. You should give in, Mr. Wheeler. Fighting only makes the transition more painful. With tremendous effort, Thomas straightened. Where is your father now? In the garden. The alignment must be perfect for the final transfer. This was the opportunity Thomas needed. And the study, is it guarded? Henry's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Why do you ask? Thomas thought quickly. I'm a journalist. Even now I want to understand. To record. The symbols on the clock, what language are they? Not a language you could comprehend, Henry said proudly. It predates human civilization. The clock itself was built in 1412, but its mechanisms are based on principles discovered centuries earlier. While the boy spoke, Thomas gathered his remaining strength. The study was near and momentarily unguarded. If he could just reach it. The clock is alive in a way, Henry continued, warming to his subject. It doesn't just measure time, it manipulates it, bends it. The original was created by... Thomas lunged suddenly, pushing past the startled boy and staggering toward the study door. Behind him, Henry cried out in alarm. Thomas reached the door, fumbled with the handle, and practically fell into the study as the door swung open. The master clock dominated the room just as before, its face shifting hypnotically, hands moving in that unnatural counterclockwise motion. Thomas lurched toward it, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His gaze fell on a heavy brass letter opener on Augustus's desk. Henry appeared in the doorway. "Stop! You don't understand what you're doing!" Thomas seized the letter opener and raised it above the clock's face. "I understand perfectly. You're killing us to extend your own lives." "It's more than that," Henry insisted, his childish voice cracking. "The work requires continuity. Understanding that can only be achieved through centuries of uninterrupted study." "At too high a price," Thomas declared, and brought the letter opener down with all his remaining strength. The brass point struck the clock face and stopped, hovering millimeters above the surface as though held by an invisible barrier. Thomas pushed harder, muscles straining, but could not force the point through. Henry laughed, the sound unnervingly adult coming from his childish throat. "Did you think it would be that easy? The clock is protected." From somewhere below came a crash and shouts. Holloway must have reached the garden. Henry's head whipped toward the sound. "Father!" he cried and ran from the room. Thomas redoubled his efforts, pressing against the invisible barrier with all his might. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the room's chill. His arms trembled with exertion and the accelerated aging process. "Break, damn you!" he growled through clenched teeth. The letter opener slipped, slicing across his palm. Blood welled from the wound, dripping onto the clock face. Where the droplets touched the mysterious symbols, they sizzled and smoked. Thomas stared in sudden understanding. Blood. It needed blood. Without hesitation, he pressed his bleeding palm against the clock face. The effect was immediate. The symbols began to glow a sickly red, the hands spinning wildly. The ticking accelerated to a frantic pace, the wood and brass vibrating beneath his touch. A high-pitched whine emanated from the clock, rising in pitch until it became painful to the ears. Thomas maintained the pressure, feeling something pull at him through his palm. Not years this time, but something deeper, more fundamental. The clock face cracked beneath his hand, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. The hands bent and twisted, tearing free of their moorings. From throughout the house came the sounds of breaking glass and splintering wood as the connected clocks self-destructed in a cascade of failure. Thomas staggered back as the master clock began to disintegrate, brass components melting, wood charring as though in an invisible fire. The symbols flared blindingly bright, then faded to ash. A scream of rage and despair echoed through the house, Augustus sensing the destruction of his precious mechanism. Thomas collapsed to his knees, suddenly overwhelmed by dizziness. The room spun around him as reality seemed to fracture and reform. Something was happening to the flow of time itself, speeding up, slowing down, reversing in unpredictable surges. He needed to get back to Margaret. Summoning his last reserves of strength, Thomas dragged himself to his feet and stumbled from the study, the floor undulating beneath him like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. The house had become a maelstrom of temporal distortion. As Thomas staggered through the corridors toward the east wing, he witnessed impossible scenes flickering around him like frames from misaligned film reels. A maid dusting a sideboard aged to dust before his eyes, her flesh withering, bones collapsing into a pile of grey powder that was swept away by unseen currents. In the next moment, the same spot showed a child in Victorian dress playing with a wooden toy, oblivious to Thomas's presence. Then emptiness. Then all three simultaneously, layered over each other like transparent photographs. The walls themselves seemed to age and rejuvenate, wallpaper fading, peeling, then suddenly fresh again. Wood rotting, then restoring, darkening with age, then lightening to new-cut lumber. Thomas pressed on, disoriented but determined. The destruction of the master clock had disrupted whatever process the Larkins had established, but the consequences were proving chaotic and unpredictable. "Margaret!" he called out, his voice sounding distant and hollow in the distorted space. "Margaret!" A familiar figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, Dr. Wells, looking bizarrely younger than when Thomas had last seen him, his grey hair now peppered with returning brown. "Wheeler!" Wells shouted, his voice fluctuating in pitch and volume. "What have you done?" "Destroyed the clock," Thomas replied, reaching him. "The process is broken." Wells grabbed his arm, pointing toward the windows. Outside, the night sky flickered between darkness, dawn light, and daylight in rapid succession. In the garden, the ceremonial arrangement was in disarray, chairs overturned, the Larkin family members rushing in confusion. "The temporal backlash is affecting everything," Wells explained, scientific curiosity momentarily overcoming his fear. "The years they've stolen are being released, but chaotically, some returning to their owners, some dispersing into the environment." "Margaret? The others?" "This way." Wells led him down the corridor. "Something strange is happening to all of us. The aging is reversing in some, accelerating in others." They reached Thomas's room to find the door ajar. Inside, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, looking much as she had when they had arrived at the estate. The premature aging had vanished from her features. Beside her, Edward lay still, his body shrunken and desiccated, clearly dead. "He was too far gone," Margaret said quietly as Thomas rushed to embrace her. "The shock of the reversal was too much for his system." "But you're yourself again," Thomas said wonderingly, touching her face. "Not everyone is so fortunate," Wells interjected grimly. "Mrs. Prescott has continued to age, while her husband has reverted to his proper years. Mayor Holloway appears frozen in time, neither aging nor rejuvenating." From below came a thunderous crash, followed by the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. The floor trembled beneath their feet. "The house is becoming unstable," Wells warned. "The temporal distortions are affecting its physical structure. We need to leave immediately." "Would the Larkins?" Thomas asked. "I saw Augustus in the garden," Wells replied. "He appeared to be decomposing, as though all the years he'd stolen were claiming their due at once." Thomas helped Margaret to her feet. "Can we get to the carriages?" "If we hurry." "The effect seems most intense near the center of the house. The peripheral areas are more stable." They made their way downstairs, the grand staircase creaking and shifting beneath them. In the foyer, they found Mrs. Prescott supporting her bewildered husband, who looked at his significantly older wife with confusion. "Herbert doesn't remember anything," she explained, her voice frail in her aged throat. "Perhaps that's a blessing." Mayor Holloway waited by the front doors, his expression vacant. He had stopped at what appeared to be 60 years of age, his once robust frame gaunt, movements mechanical. The loss of his wife seemed to have broken something fundamental within him. "We need to get to the carriages," Thomas urged. "The house is collapsing." As if to emphasize his point, a chandelier crashed to the floor behind them, crystal shattering across the marble tiles. The walls were visibly shifting now, foundations settling unevenly as temporal currents rippled through the structure. They pushed through the front doors into the pre-dawn air. The garden was a scene of chaos. plants, growing, blooming, dying, and regenerating in rapid cycles. The ceremonial arrangement had been completely destroyed, chairs splintered as though they had aged centuries in minutes. Of the Larkin family, there was a more disturbing sign. Victoria and James lay on the frozen ground, their bodies desiccated husks, as though millennia rather than decades had been extracted from them. Of Augustus and Eliza there was no sign. Young Henry sat alone on a garden bench, watching the destruction with those uncanny grey eyes, apparently unaffected by the temporal backlash. As they hurried toward the carriages, the boy called out to Thomas, "You've destroyed generations of work, Mr. Wheeler. The culmination may never be achieved now." Thomas paused, looking back at the child. "What was it all for, Henry? What could possibly justify such a cost?" Henry's smile was ancient in his young face. Transcendence. Freedom from time itself. My father believed we were only 3 generations away from completion. "Find another way," Thomas said firmly, "one that doesn't steal lives." "There is no other way," Henry replied sadly. "But it doesn't matter now. We'll rebuild, begin again. Time is the one resource that never truly runs out for someone." A large section of the mansion's roof collapsed with a deafening roar. Henry didn't flinch, continuing to watch them with eerie calm. "You won't remember any of this clearly," he called as they reached the carriages. "The distortions will affect your minds as well as your bodies. By this time tomorrow, it will all seem like a strange dream." "We'll remember," Thomas insisted, helping Margaret into their carriage. "I'll write it down, warn others." Henry's laugh was chilling in its adult cynicism. "Many have tried, Mr. Wheeler. Their accounts are dismissed as fever dreams or fantasy. Time protects its own secrets." As their carriage pulled away from the crumbling estate, Thomas looked back one last time. Dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight illuminating the destruction. The mansion seemed to be aging rapidly now, wood rotting, stone crumbling, sections disappearing into temporal distortions that bent light around them like heat mirages. On the garden bench, Henry remained, a small, solitary figure amid the chaos. As Thomas watched, the boy's form flickered and shifted, momentarily appearing as an old man, then a young adult, then a child again, unstable, yet somehow enduring. The last thing Thomas saw before the estate disappeared from view was Henry raising his hand in a gesture that might have been farewell, or perhaps a promise of future reckoning. The journey back to Redwood Falls was surreal. Snow fell around them, but strangely, sometimes drifting upward, sometimes hanging suspended in mid-air before continuing its descent. The landscape itself seemed unstable, trees aging and rejuvenating as they passed, fields cycling through seasons in the span of minutes. Inside the carriage, Thomas held Margaret close, reassuring himself of her presence, her restored youth. His own body had largely returned to its proper age, though his hair remained streaked with premature grey, a permanent reminder of the night's horrors. "Do you think Henry was right?" Margaret asked softly. "Will we forget?" Thomas pressed his hand to his pocket, where he'd placed his notebook. Throughout the night, he'd jotted observations when possible, determined to preserve a record. "I won't let us forget. I'll write it all down as soon as we reach home." The other carriages followed behind them, Dr. Wells alone in one, the Prescotts in another, and Mayor Holloway driving his own carriage in mechanical silence, his wife's body wrapped in blankets in the back. As they approached town, Thomas noted with alarm that the temporal disturbances extended beyond the estate. Buildings in Redwood Falls shifted subtly, weathering, then restoring. People moved in the streets with occasional jerky motions, as though skipping forward or backward in time by seconds or minutes. "The effects are spreading," he murmured. "Will it stop?" Margaret asked anxiously. "I don't know." Wells theorized that the released temporal energy needs to disperse, like ripples in a pond, eventually fading. They reached their home as the sun rose fully above the horizon. Thomas helped Margaret inside, struck by how normal everything appeared after the night's impossibilities. Their modest living room, his desk with half-written articles, Margaret's knitting basket, all exactly as they'd left them. It seemed impossible that just hours ago they had been fighting for their lives against a family of time thieves. "I need to write it all down," Thomas said, moving immediately to his desk. Margaret touched his arm. "Rest first. Just for a little while." Thomas shook his head. "While it's fresh, while I still remember clearly." He lit his lamp and began to write feverishly, filling page after page with descriptions of the Larkin estate, the reversed clocks, the aging process, the garden ceremony. As he wrote, he found certain details becoming hazy: the exact appearance of the master clock, the precise words Augustus had spoken about their work. He pushed through the mental fog, determined to capture as much as possible. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gradually normalizing as the temporal disturbances diminished. By mid-morning, when Thomas finally set down his pen, the world outside his window appeared to have stabilized. "It's done," he told Margaret, who had been watching him with concern. "As much as I can remember. What will you do with it?" Thomas rubbed his eyes. "Publish it. People need to be warned. The Larkins might be gone, but Henry survived. He talked about rebuilding, beginning again." Margaret frowned. "Will anyone believe it? It sounds like madness," Thomas finished for her. "I know, but I have corroboration. Wells, the Prescotts, Holloway, and physical evidence." He touched his prematurely grey hair. "Some of the effects remain." A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas opened it to find Dr. Wells on his doorstep, looking exhausted but determined. "Wheeler," he greeted tersely, "we need to talk." Thomas ushered him inside. Wells had also retained some evidence of premature aging, deeper lines around his eyes, a slight stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "The effects are fading," Wells reported without preamble. "I've been monitoring the temporal anomalies around town. They're diminishing exponentially. By this evening, I believe things will have largely normalized." "And the physical changes to people?" Thomas asked. Wells shook his head. "Variable. Mrs. Prescott remains significantly aged. Holloway seems frozen in his partially aged state, physically and mentally. He barely speaks, moves like an automaton. I've sedated him for now." "And the Larkins, the estate?" "I drove back to check an hour ago," Wells said grimly. "There's nothing left, just a cleared foundation and scattered rubble that looks centuries old. No sign of the family except—" He hesitated. "Except," Thomas prompted. "I found this on what would have been the front steps." Wells reached into his pocket and produced a small brass object, a child's toy soldier, antique in design, but gleaming as though newly made. Attached was a scrap of paper with a single line written in elegant script: "Until the next cycle." Thomas felt a chill. "Henry, it seems the boy survived and remembers," Wells confirmed. "Then my account is even more important." Thomas gestured to his manuscript. "People must be warned." Wells and Margaret exchanged a glance that Thomas didn't miss. "What?" he demanded. "Thomas," Margaret said gently, "people are already forgetting." "Forgetting? How?" Wells sighed heavily. "I spoke with the Prescotts on my way here. Herbert has no recollection of the Larkin estate or being invited there. He believes his wife's aging is due to a strange illness. Mrs. Prescott herself remembers going to the estate, but describes it as an unpleasant dinner party where she felt unwell. The details are rapidly fading from her mind." "That's impossible," Thomas protested. "We lived through a nightmare just hours ago." "The temporal distortions affected minds as well as bodies," Wells explained. "Henry warned us this would happen, remember? And it's not just memories. Physical evidence is disappearing too. The invitation you received? Check it." With a sense of dread, Thomas went to the drawer where he'd placed the Larkins' invitation. Inside was only a blank sheet of expensive paper. The elegant script and embossed border completely vanished. "No," he whispered. "This can't be happening." "I believe it's part of the protection mechanism," Wells said. "Whatever the Larkins were doing, whatever force they were manipulating, it conceals itself, heals the ruptures in its fabric." Thomas clutched his manuscript. "But I've written it all down." "For now," Wells said ominously. "I suspect you'll find those pages blank by tomorrow, or the ink faded to illegibility. Then I'll publish today, immediately. Get it to the printer before it can fade." Wells shook his head. "I've already tried documenting my observations. The ink fades as I write. Photographs I took of the temporal anomalies develop completely blank." "There must be a way," Thomas insisted. "We can't just forget what happened, what's still happening to Holloway and Mrs. Prescott. Their conditions will be attributed to illness or shock," Wells said with resignation. "Already people in town are constructing alternative explanations. Mrs. Holloway's death is being described as heart failure. The damage to our bodies is a strange epidemic." Thomas paced in frustration. "So we do nothing, allow Henry to rebuild his family's monstrous work, wait for another cycle of victims 30 years from now." "I didn't say that," Wells replied firmly. "I said we can't document it conventionally, but we can take other precautions." He tapped his temple. "Memory may fade, but knowledge can be preserved in different ways. Symbolic representations, oral traditions, warnings passed down that may not include the full context, but contain the essential caution." Thomas considered this. "A coded warning, then, something that would alert future generations to be wary of the Larkins without directly stating what happened." "Precisely," Wells nodded. "And physical preparations, a society or group dedicated to watching for their return, even if they don't fully remember why." The rest of the day was spent in urgent planning. Thomas drafted a series of articles that, while not explicitly describing the temporal phenomena, established the Larkin estate as a place of mysterious disappearances and ill fortune. He created a children's cautionary tale about a family who stole time, disguising it as fiction but containing enough truth to serve as a warning. Wells, meanwhile, contacted colleagues in neighboring towns, sharing sanitized versions of their experience framed as medical curiosities or scientific anomalies. Together, they established a small trust fund dedicated to monitoring any unusual construction on the former Larkin property, with instructions passing to their descendants. By evening, as Wells had predicted, the temporal disturbances had largely subsided. The snow fell normally, clocks throughout town ran at their proper pace, and people moved without the jerky time skips of the morning. And, as feared, memories were fading. When Thomas visited Mayor Holloway that night, the man had constructed an entirely new recollection of events, claiming his wife had suffered a stroke during a dinner party at that old property outside town, and that the shock had affected his own health. Mrs. Prescott now firmly believed she had contracted a rare aging disease during a trip to Minneapolis. Only her husband's concerned confusion about her condition hinted at the truth. Even Margaret was showing signs of memory alteration, referring to that strange dream we all seemed to share about the Larkins by bedtime. Thomas found his own memories becoming less certain, details blurring, sequences confusing, emotions dulling. Only his written account remained clear, and even that showed signs of fading ink on the earliest pages. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat at his window, watching the snow and wondering if somewhere out there, Henry Larkin was already planning the family's return. The boy's words echoed in his mind. Until the next cycle. Morning would bring further forgetting. Within days, the entire incident might be reduced to vague unease about the old property on Blackwood Hill. Within weeks, perhaps not even that would remain. But Thomas was determined to preserve something, some warning, some protection for future generations. As dawn approached, he made a decision. Taking his manuscript, now half faded, he carefully removed the pages from his notebook and replaced them with fresh sheets. On these, he began to write a new account, not the literal truth that time itself seemed determined to erase, but a fictional tale of horror about a family that stole years from their victims. The Larkin Estate, he titled it. The family that aged 30 years overnight on Christmas Eve. Even if the facts faded from memory, perhaps the emotional truth of their experience could endure as fiction, a warning wrapped in a tale, strange enough to capture attention, but plausible enough to instill caution. As the first light of day broke over Redwood Falls, Thomas finished his story and signed his name. Already, the memories were becoming dreamlike, distant, but the story remained, and would remain, he hoped, long after direct memory had failed. Outside his window, the snow had stopped. A new day began, time moving forward at its proper pace. For now, December 20th, 1952. Snow fell in thick, heavy curtains across the Minnesota landscape, blanketing Redwood Falls in pristine white. Eleanor Wheeler, daughter of the late Thomas and Margaret Wheeler, clutched a cream-colored envelope in her gloved hand as she trudged up the path to her modest home. The elegant, swooping script of her name on the front contrasted sharply with the utilitarian mailbox it had arrived in. Inside, she hung her coat on the rack and examined the invitation more closely. The paper was expensive, thicker than anything she'd ever received, with an embossed golden border that caught the light from her lamp. The seal on the back featured an ornate L pressed into deep red wax. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over her as she broke the seal. Something about this invitation felt familiar, though she couldn't place why. Inside was an invitation to a Christmas Eve gathering at the recently reconstructed estate on Blackwood Hill, a property that had sat as ruins for decades before being purchased and rebuilt over the past year by a new family in town, the Larkins. Eleanor frowned, the name triggering an inexplicable unease. Had she heard it before? Perhaps in one of her father's old stories. Thomas Wheeler had been Redwood Falls' most prominent journalist before his death 5 years earlier, known for his factual reporting, but also for the strange, cautionary tales he occasionally published. On her bookshelf sat a collection of his works, including a curious horror story he'd revised and republished several times throughout his life. The Larkin Estate, the family that aged 30 years overnight on Christmas Eve. She'd always assumed it was fiction, though her father had insisted with peculiar intensity that she read it annually on Christmas Eve. Eleanor set the invitation aside and retrieved the slim volume, opening to the story she knew almost by heart. The tale of a journalist and his wife invited to a mysterious estate where a family stole time from their guests through reversed clocks and strange rituals. Just a story, of course. And yet, the invitation requested a response. Eleanor found herself oddly reluctant to touch it again. Instead, she opened her father's desk drawer, where she kept his personal effects. Among them was a sealed envelope he had left for her, with instructions to open it if the Larkins ever returned to Redwood Falls. She'd always thought it an odd request, assuming it related somehow to his fiction. Now, with trembling fingers, she broke the seal on her father's letter. Inside was a sheet of yellowed paper, the ink faded but still legible. Eleanor, if you're reading this, then they have returned. The story is true. Do not accept their invitation. Do not allow anyone else to accept. Warn Dr. Wells's son. He may remember something his father told him. Look for the grey eyes and the reversed clocks. 30 years is their cycle. Be vigilant. All my love, Father. Eleanor stared at the letter, then at the invitation on her table. Outside, the snow continued to fall as twilight settled over Redwood Falls. In the distance, barely visible through the white curtain, stood the newly reconstructed mansion on Blackwood Hill, a single light burning in its highest window. She reached for her telephone. There were calls to make, people to warn. The cycle, it seemed, was beginning again. Eleanor Wheeler stood at her living room window, watching the snow swirl across her front yard. Behind her, 5 of Redwood Falls' most respected citizens sat in tense silence, staring at the items spread across her coffee table: the Larkin invitation, her father's warning letter, and the worn copy of his story. Dr. Robert Wells, Jr., son of her father's old friend, was the first to speak. "I always thought my father's obsession with clock mechanisms was merely a hobby. Now I understand why he insisted I learn how they work, how to disable them if necessary." Mayor Thompson, a pragmatic woman in her 50s, seemed less convinced. "This is all very disturbing, Eleanor, but it sounds like folklore, mass hysteria perhaps, that affected your father's generation." "Then explain this," Eleanor said, pointing to a photograph. It showed a younger version of Mayor Holloway, who had preceded Thompson in office. Though the man in the photo was only in his 40s, his face bore the weathered look of someone 20 years older, his eyes vacant. Holloway was never the same after that Christmas Eve. He served as mayor, but everyone knew his wife actually ran things until her death. Richard Prescott, whose grandfather had apparently been among the original victims, fidgeted uncomfortably. "My grandmother aged decades overnight, according to family stories. Doctors could never explain it. Grandfather insisted until his death that she'd contracted a rare disease, but she told me different stories when I was young, before she made me promise never to speak of it." "What did she tell you?" Eleanor pressed. "Fragments, mostly. Something about clocks running backward, people aging before her eyes." Prescott shook his head. "I always thought they were delusions from whatever affected her health." The local librarian, Ms. Abernathy, who had joined them because of her extensive knowledge of town history, cleared her throat. "There are inconsistencies in the town records from December 1922. Death certificates with conflicting causes, property records for the original estate that appear and disappear from the archives. I found newspaper articles your father wrote that reference the Larkins, but the ink has faded to near illegibility on just those sections. The final member of their gathering, Sheriff Davis, had remained silent until now. 3 days ago, I met the new owner of the estate when he came to file building permits. Called himself Augustus Larkin, distinguished older gentleman with silver-streaked dark hair and the strangest grey eyes I've ever seen. Had his son with him, Henry I think he called him, boy of about 12 with the same eyes." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. Her father's story mentioned an Augustus and Henry Larkin. Same names, same descriptions. "They've sent out more invitations," Sheriff Davis continued. "The Thompsons, the Wellses, the Prescotts, the Abernathys, and the Davises all received identical invitations to a Christmas Eve gathering. All descendants of those who were allegedly involved 30 years ago," Eleanor noted. "Except my invitation, I'm the only direct descendant in town." "Aye. What exactly are you suggesting we do?" Mayor Thompson asked, practical as always. "We can't arrest people for sending party invitations, no matter how creepy the coincidence." "We warn people not to attend," Eleanor said firmly. "We watch the estate, and we prepare, just in case my father wasn't delusional, just in case there's something to his story." Dr. Wells nodded. "My father left me a locked box with instructions similar to Thomas Wheeler's letter. Inside were tools designed specifically for disabling clock mechanisms, along with notes on something he called temporal distortion. I always thought it was related to his scientific research, but now—" "This is absurd," Mayor Thompson protested, though with less conviction. "You're suggesting we prepare to fight some sort of— what? Time vampires?" "I'm suggesting we take precautions," Eleanor corrected. "If nothing happens, we've lost nothing but a few hours of preparation. If something does happen," she gestured to her father's story, "then we're the only defense our town has." Reluctantly, the group agreed to a plan. Sheriff Davis would station deputies to monitor the estate from a distance. Dr. Wells would analyze the strange tools his father had left him. Richard Prescott would speak privately with other invitation recipients, subtly discouraging attendance. Ms. Abernathy would continue searching town records for additional information. Mayor Thompson, still skeptical but unwilling to ignore potential threats to her town, would ensure emergency services remained fully staffed on Christmas Eve, contrary to the usual skeleton crew. As the meeting concluded and her guests departed into the snowy evening, Eleanor remained by the window, watching the distant lights of the reconstructed Larkin estate twinkling through the falling snow. Had her father experienced this same sense of foreboding 30 years ago, this mixture of disbelief and dread? She picked up his story again, reading his description of the mansion with its gargoyles and tower. The new construction matched it perfectly. Though no photographs of the original structure existed in town records, how could the Larkins have recreated it so precisely unless— Eleanor pushed the thought away. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps blueprints existed somewhere. Perhaps her father's story had incorporated the real architectural details of a building he'd actually visited, even if the supernatural elements were fabrication. Yet the coincidences were too numerous, too specific to dismiss entirely. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself watching clocks obsessively, studying their mechanisms as though they might suddenly reverse. She visited the town's oldest residents, asking casual questions about 1922, but found their memories of that period strangely hazy. Several mentioned a bad winter where many suffered from an unusual illness, but details were inconsistent. 3 days before Christmas Eve, she decided to see the estate for herself. Driving to the edge of town, she parked at the base of Blackwood Hill and hiked through the snow toward the wrought iron gates that marked the property's boundary. The mansion beyond was indeed impressive, 3 stories of dark stone and wood, with a central tower that rose another 20 feet above the roofline. Smoke curled from several chimneys, promising warmth within. The resemblance to her father's description was uncanny. As she stood observing from behind a large oak tree, the front door opened. A tall man emerged, Augustus Larkin, she presumed, followed by a woman in black who must be his wife, Eliza. They stood on the porch briefly, surveying the grounds, before Augustus pointed toward the gardens where workers were clearing snow. Eleanor couldn't hear their conversation, but something about their fluid, synchronized movements seemed unnatural. They turned simultaneously to go back inside, and as they did, Augustus paused. He looked directly toward the oak tree where Eleanor stood, as though sensing her presence despite the distance and her concealment. A chill that had nothing to do with the December cold ran through her. She remained perfectly still until the couple went back inside, then carefully retraced her steps to her car. That evening, she received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Wells arrived at her door looking disturbed, carrying a small wooden box. "I've been examining my father's tools," he explained without preamble, following her into the living room. "The mechanics are like nothing I've seen before. They're designed to interfere with clock mechanisms, yes, but in ways that defy conventional physics." He opened the box, revealing an assortment of brass instruments that resembled watchmakers' tools, but with strange modifications. One looked like a tuning fork with cryptic markings etched along its tines. "This one vibrates at a frequency that should be impossible to maintain," Wells demonstrated, striking it gently against the table. The fork emitted a tone just at the edge of hearing, not quite sound, but something that made the air seem to thicken around it. "And these markings, they're mathematical equations for something my father called temporal resonance." Eleanor felt her skepticism weakening further. "You believe it now, don't you? My father's story." Wells nodded reluctantly. "Either both our fathers shared the same delusion in remarkable detail, or—" He left the alternative unspoken. "Have you had any success discouraging people from accepting the invitations?" she asked. "Mixed," Wells admitted. "Some were easily persuaded to decline. Others found the mystery of the long, isolated estate too intriguing to resist. The Jacksons, the Millers, and unfortunately the Thompsons have all indicated they plan to attend. The mayor, even after our meeting, especially after." She believes attending personally is the responsible choice, to either debunk our concerns or confirm them firsthand. Eleanor sighed. That's 5 potential victims. How many total invitations were sent? 8 families. 3 have declined. 5 accepted. Perfect for a pentagram arrangement, Eleanor murmured, remembering her father's description of the garden ceremony. The night before Christmas Eve, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She paced her home, checking and rechecking the preparations they had made. Sheriff Davis had stationed deputies on the roads leading to the estate, with instructions to maintain a subtle presence, but intervene if anything unusual occurred. Dr. Wells had distributed his father's strange instruments among their small group with instructions on their theorized uses. Mayor Thompson had promised to maintain hourly telephone contact from inside the estate. It felt simultaneously excessive and inadequate. What if her father's story was merely fiction? What if it wasn't? Around midnight, her telephone rang. "Eleanor?" It was Miss Abernathy, the librarian, her voice tight with excitement. "I found something in the basement archives, a sealed box with your father's name on it, dated December 26th, 1922. What's inside?" "I haven't opened it yet. It has instructions to deliver it to his descendants if anyone named Larkin ever returned to Redwood Falls. I can bring it over now." 20 minutes later, they sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, staring at the aged cardboard box sealed with wax and twine. The wax bore the impression of her father's signet ring, a distinctive W that matched the one she now wore on a chain around her neck. With trembling fingers, Eleanor cut the twine and broke the seal. Inside, wrapped in preserving wax paper, was a collection of items: a brass letter opener with a dark stain on its tip, a small vial containing what appeared to be dried blood, several pages of notes in her father's handwriting, and most disturbing of all, a pocket watch with its face shattered, the numbers around its edge arranged in reverse order. "My God," whispered Miss Abernathy. "The watch from his story." Eleanor carefully unfolded the notes. Unlike her father's letter, which had faded significantly, these pages remained crisp and legible. The first page contained a single paragraph. "If you are reading this, then the Larkins have returned, and my public warning, disguised as fiction, was insufficient to prevent their re-establishment. I preserved these items using methods Dr. Wells and I discovered could resist the temporal effects that erased other evidence. The blood on the letter opener is mine, mixed with the strange fluid that leaked from the master clock when I damaged it. The vial contains a sample I collected from the clock face. The watch belonged to Henry Larkin, the only one I could take before fleeing the estate. These physical links to that night may be your only weapons against what is to come." The remaining pages contain detailed observations of the temporal phenomena they had witnessed, scientific speculations from Dr. Wells, and most importantly, instructions for disrupting the Larkin ceremony. The key, it seemed, was the master clock, but also the blood. "The clock reacted to blood," Eleanor read aloud. "Specifically, the blood of those from whom it was stealing time. When my blood touched the symbols, it created a feedback loop that disrupted the entire process." Miss Abernathy looked up sharply. "Blood magic? That sounds like superstition, not science." "My father writes that Dr. Wells theorized it wasn't magic at all, but a biological component to the temporal transfer. The Larkins weren't just stealing time as an abstract concept. They were extracting something physical from their victims, something carried in the bloodstream. They studied the documents until dawn, gradually forming a plan that incorporated her father's observations with their modern resources. By morning, Eleanor felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. For the first time since receiving the invitation, she had more than just suspicion and folklore. She had evidence and a potential strategy. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold. Eleanor gathered with her fellow conspirators at Sheriff Davis's office for a final review of their plan. Mayor Thompson called to confirm she and her husband would attend the Larkins' dinner, but would maintain hourly telephone contact. If they missed a check-in, the sheriff would have cause to investigate. Dr. Wells had reconfigured his father's instruments based on the new information, creating devices that might disrupt the temporal harvesting process. Eleanor carried her father's letter opener and the vial of dried blood, reconstituted with saline solution, in a small pouch around her neck. As twilight approached, they took their positions. Sheriff Davis and a deputy established a discreet observation point with a clear view of the estate. Ms. Abernathy remained at the telephone exchange, ready to coordinate communications. Richard Prescott waited with a vehicle at the base of Blackwood Hill. Dr. Wells and Eleanor prepared to approach the estate under cover of darkness. The first warning sign came at precisely 7 p.m. when Mayor Thompson failed to make her first scheduled call. By 7:15, Sheriff Davis had tried calling the estate, receiving no answer. By 7:30, they enacted the first phase of their contingency plan. Dr. Wells and Eleanor, dressed in dark clothing, made their way through the snowy grounds toward the rear of the estate. From their vantage point, they could see the dining room windows, where silhouettes moved around a long table. All appeared normal, a simple dinner party. Yet as they watched, Eleanor noticed something odd. The movements of the figures inside seemed occasionally to stutter, as though skipping forward or backward by fractions of a second. And the snow, in the immediate vicinity of the house, snowflakes hung suspended in the air, or fell with unnatural slowness. "It's already beginning," she whispered to Wells. "The temporal distortion." Wells nodded grimly, removing one of his father's devices from his pocket, the tuning fork-like instrument. He struck it gently, and the strange, not-quite sound vibrated through the air. The suspended snowflakes nearest them suddenly released, falling naturally again. "It works," he breathed. "At least locally." They continued their circuit of the house, looking for the best entry point. According to her father's notes, the master clock would be in Augustus's study in the West Wing. They needed to reach it before the garden ceremony began. As they approached the west side of the mansion, Eleanor felt a strange heaviness in her limbs, a sluggishness that had nothing to do with the cold or exertion. Wells seemed to feel it too, his movements becoming labored. "Time is thicker here," he murmured, striking the tuning fork again. The effect provided momentary relief, but faded quickly. A servant's entrance provided their way in, a small door near the kitchen, secured with a simple lock that Sheriff Davis had provided tools to bypass. Inside, the warmth was immediate, as was the subtle wrongness of the environment. The air itself seemed viscous, sounds muffled, yet somehow stretched. They moved carefully through the kitchen, past busy servants who took no notice of them, their attention completely focused on their tasks, movements mechanical and precise. Eleanor noticed with a shudder that all the servants appeared unusually aged for their apparent roles, young bodies with prematurely lined faces and graying hair. In the main hallway, they flattened themselves against the wall as James and Victoria Larkin passed by, engaged in conversation. Unlike her father's description of young adults, these Larkins appeared middle-aged, perhaps 40 and 38, respectively. Had the family's timeline shifted, or had the cycle begun earlier this time? "We need to hurry," Wells whispered once the Larkins had passed. "If they've accelerated the process—" They made their way toward the West Wing, using her father's description as a guide. The layout matched his account perfectly, down to the corridor lined with family portraits. Eleanor paused briefly, confirming what her father had written. The same faces appeared across different eras, Augustus in Victorian dress, then Edwardian, then modern. "They're immortal," Wells breathed. "Or near enough." "Not immortal," Eleanor corrected. "Just thieves." At the end of the corridor stood the ornate door to Augustus's study. Light spilled from beneath it, and the sound of ticking, dozens of clocks slightly out of sync, emanated from within. Wells pressed his ear to the door. "Someone's inside." Eleanor reached for the pouch around her neck, removing the letter opener, the same one her father had used 30 years ago. Its brass point still carried a dark stain. "We need a distraction," she whispered. As if in answer, a bell tolled somewhere in the house, deep and resonant. The ticking behind the door faltered momentarily, then resumed at a different tempo. The summons, Eleanor realized. They're calling their guests to the garden. Footsteps approached the door from within. They barely had time to duck into an alcove before the door opened and Augustus Larkin emerged. He looked exactly as Sheriff Davis had described. Distinguished, silver-streaked dark hair, penetrating grey eyes. He carried a leather-bound ledger, identical to the one in her father's account. When Augustus had disappeared down the stairs, Wells moved quickly to the door. It had been left unlocked. Taking a deep breath, they entered the study. The room was just as described, walls lined with clocks of every description, all with reversed numbering. At the center, on a pedestal, sat the master clock, large and ornate, crafted of dark wood and gleaming brass, its face swirling with unnatural movement. Wells immediately began setting up his father's devices around the room, small brass instruments placed strategically near the most important-looking clocks. Eleanor approached the master clock, studying the symbols inscribed around its face, curves and angles that seemed to shift position when she wasn't looking directly at them. "How much time do we have?" she asked, removing the vial of reconstituted blood. "Minutes at most," Wells replied, activating the last device. "Once they've positioned their guests in the garden." Eleanor uncorked the vial. According to her father's notes, the blood of a victim, even decades old, should create a disruption in the harvesting process. She hesitated, then made a decision. Taking the letter opener, she made a small cut across her palm, allowing her fresh blood to mix with the reconstituted sample. "What are you doing?" Wells hissed. "Insurance," Eleanor replied. "My father's blood disrupted the process before. Mine shares his bloodline. Together—" She pressed her bleeding palm against the clock face, directly onto the shifting symbols. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the symbols began to glow a sickly red, the hands spinning wildly. The ticking accelerated to a frantic pace, the wood and brass vibrating beneath her touch. A high-pitched whine emanated from the clock, rising in pitch until it became painful to the ears. Wells activated the tuning fork device, creating a counter-vibration that seemed to stabilize the effect somewhat, directing it rather than just releasing it chaotically. The clock face cracked beneath Eleanor's hand, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. The hands bent and twisted, tearing free of their moorings. From throughout the house came the sounds of breaking glass and splintering wood as the connected clocks began to self-destruct. A scream of rage echoed through the house, Augustus sensing the destruction of his precious mechanism. "We need to leave," Wells urged. "Now!" But Eleanor kept her hand pressed to the clock, remembering her father's account of the temporal backlash. "Not yet. We need to make sure it's completely disabled." The symbols flared, blindingly bright, then began to fade to ash. As they did, a wave of temporal distortion emanated from the clock, visible as a ripple in the air that spread outward in all directions. "Now we run," Eleanor said, finally pulling her hand away. They fled the study, the mansion beginning to warp around them as reality fractured. The corridors stretched and compressed, walls aging and rejuvenating in patches. They passed a maid who aged to dust before their eyes, then rematerialized seconds later, oblivious to her momentary dissolution. In the grand foyer, they encountered chaos. The dinner guests, including Mayor Thompson and her husband, were staggering toward the door, their bodies fluctuating between their proper ages and accelerated aging. The Larkin family was nowhere to be seen. "Help them," Eleanor instructed Wells, who began using his father's devices to stabilize the temporal effects around the disoriented guests. A child's voice called her name. Eleanor turned to find Henry Larkin, standing on the stairs, watching her with those uncanny grey eyes. "Wheeler," he said, recognition in his voice. Another Wheeler. How interesting. Despite his youthful appearance, his voice held centuries of weariness. Unlike the others, he seemed unaffected by the temporal chaos erupting around them. "It's over, Henry," Eleanor said firmly. Again. The boy smiled sadly. "For now. But time is long, Miss Wheeler, and memory is short." Not this time," Eleanor countered. "We've taken precautions, records that won't fade, witnesses who won't forget." "Others have tried," Henry said, echoing the words he'd spoken to her father 30 years before. "Time protects its own secrets." Behind her, Wells was ushering the last of the guests outside. The mansion groaned around them, foundations shifting as temporal currents rippled through the structure. "This house will fall again," Eleanor said, "and if you rebuild, we'll be waiting. Every 30 years if necessary." Henry's smile widened, revealing teeth too old for his young face. "Perhaps, or perhaps next time, we'll choose a different town, a different approach." He gestured toward the door. "You should leave now. The collapse will be more dramatic than last time, I think." As Eleanor backed toward the exit, Henry remained on the stairs, a small, solitary figure amid the growing chaos. Just as her father had described, the boy's form flickered and shifted, momentarily appearing as an old man, then a young adult, then a child again. "Goodbye, Miss Wheeler," he called as she reached the door. "Until we meet again." Outside, the night air was crisp and clean, free from the cloying thickness inside. Wells had gathered the guests at a safe distance, all of them watching in bewilderment as sections of the mansion began to collapse. The temporal distortions were visible even from outside, parts of the structure aging to ruin, while others reverted to raw lumber, all shifting in chaotic patterns. "What happened in there?" Mayor Thompson demanded, her face pale but determined. Unlike 30 years ago, she showed no signs of significant aging. Wells's devices had apparently protected them from the worst effects. "Exactly what we warned you about," Eleanor replied, not unkindly. "The Larkins were attempting to steal your time, your years, just as they did to another group in 1922. "I remember now," one of the other guests said suddenly. Mrs. Miller, whose grandmother had been friends with Margaret Wheeler. "Grandmother used to tell stories about the Larkins. I always thought they were just tales to frighten children." As they watched, the central tower of the mansion collapsed with a thunderous roar. A strange light emanated briefly from the ruins, not fire, but something less definable, like reality itself, tearing and mending. "Where are the Larkins now?" Sheriff Davis asked, scanning the grounds with his flashlight. "Gone," Eleanor said with certainty, "but not forever." In the days that followed, Eleanor was surprised to discover that, unlike 30 years ago, memories of the event remained intact. The physical evidence persisted as well. Wells's devices continued to function, her father's notes remained legible, and most importantly, witnesses remembered. Perhaps it was the different nature of the disruption, Wells's careful stabilization rather than her father's desperate sabotage. Perhaps it was their preparation or the combination of old and new blood on the clock face. Whatever the reason, the truth remained accessible. They formed a committee, officially for historical preservation, unofficially to monitor for the Larkins' return. Records were established in multiple locations, with instructions passing to descendants. The ruins on Blackwood Hill were legally protected, preventing new construction without extensive review. Yet Eleanor never fully relaxed her vigilance. Henry's parting words haunted her. "Perhaps next time, we'll choose a different town." She began corresponding with historians and journalists in other communities, creating a network of aware individuals who could recognize the signs. Her father's story, once published as fiction, was reprinted with a carefully worded introduction that suggested deeper truths behind the narrative. 30 years was a long time to maintain alertness, but the Wheelers had proven their persistence. And if Henry Larkin thought time was on his side, he would discover that memory could be equally enduring when properly preserved. The next cycle whenever and wherever it came, would find watchful eyes waiting.